I'm a teacher on summer break, and my current classroom is Anthem of the Seas. Come with me to learn about beautiful Skagway, Alaska. The name Skagway is actually a Tlingit word meaning windy place or home of the north wind. Skagway wasn't always Skagway, though. Captain William Moore arrived in 1887 and decided to call it Mooresville.
Now, Captain Moore believed that a gold rush was imminent, and he wanted to build a safer passageway between Skagway, or Mooresville as he called it, and the Yukon, where the gold was going to be found. Skagway has this deep ocean water bay where ocean liners or big ships and tankers could come in. So he felt that that was a great starting point. He wanted to forge a safer path. The only path that they were using currently was called the Chilkoot Pass. It was 33 miles long, extremely treacherous, very steep in pitch, and was going to be very difficult for these prospectors to go over.
And while Moore was pretty visionary, when the gold rush actually happened, the boomtown rapidly formed around his wharf and land. By the end of 1897, Moore's 160 acres had quickly become 43, and his beloved Mooresville had been officially renamed Skagway.
As prospectors began to make the climb, they had to decide between the Chilkoot Pass, which was shorter, or Moore's White Pass, which was 10 miles longer and a little bit less steep. But in the winter months, it would become so muddy and so unbearable that it almost became impassable.
Canadian authorities required prospectors to have at least 1 ton of supplies before they were even allowed to get a permit to cross. This required multiple passes on foot or by wagon from Skagway to the White Pass summit. When Moore originally opened the trail, it was meant for experienced horsemen. It was not meant for prospectors who had never traversed this kind of terrain before, and it was definitely not meant for heavy-laden animals such as horses.
Data from the National Park Service suggests that over 3,000 horses died on the White Pass, which earned it the name the Dead Horse Trail by author Jack London.
It is also this stretch of land that inspired London's The Call of the Wild. While I have done a lot of the research myself, this is our tour guide, Becky. She was a wealth of information and somebody who I was able to ask a lot of questions of.
Prospectors' spoils were starting to show up in ports all around the country, specifically in Seattle and San Francisco. In July of 1897, a ship arrived in Seattle with what newspapers described as more than a solid ton of gold on board. A man named Michael Henney saw this and thought there's got to be a better way to get goods and services from Skagway over the White Pass, and he dreamt up the idea of the White Pass and Yukon Railroad.
Thousands of people came together to build the railroad, including prospectors that were trying to earn a living on their way to the Yukon. But because many were prospectors and were looking to find their own riches, the turnover of people working on the railroad was very high. Built in just 2 years, it was an engineering marvel of its time. It was a narrow gauge railway, which was more cost effective, and it was able to easily wind through the steep mountain terrain. But they were also able to carve through solid granite with steep grades and build trestles and tunnels. At the railroad's completion, it replaced the overland routes, any walking routes or wagon trails, and that made Skagway the true gateway to the Klondike Valley.
As you can imagine, work like this was not necessarily safe. However, thousands of people worked on this railroad, but there are only 35 known recorded incidents of fatalities while building the railroad. In August of 1898, 2 men, Maurice Dunn and Al Juno, were working on the railroad when a huge boulder slid down and crushed them
It
both.
was deemed too dangerous to remove the men, so instead they erected a cross on top of the boulder, which is now called Black Cross Rock, which still stands today as a testament to those men and the others who lost their lives in the building of the railroad. The Canadian border stands about 20 miles from Skagway. It was here where Canadian Mounted Police stopped prospectors and collected duties and taxes before allowing them into Canada.
It was also at this time that the Canadian Mounted Police checked to make sure that every prospector had the 2,000 pounds of required supplies, flour, bacon, tents, blankets, whatever it is that they needed in order to make the crossing.
The final building cost was roughly $10 million. Construction on the railway was completed on July 29, 1900, with a ceremonial golden spike, which was driven by Samuel H. Graves.
The railway remained in use until the 1980s, including a short time in the 1940s when the U.S. Army kind of absconded and took control in order to lay telegraph wires during World War II, something that Soapy Smith, somebody I'll tell you about later, probably would not have appreciated.
In the 1920s, George Buchanan founded Onto Alaska Tour. Youth would be responsible for earning one-third of the cost of their trip. Their parents would pay one-third, and Buchanan would pay the final third. During one of these tours, some boys painted Onto Alaska with Buchanan on the wall, and the lettering is maintained to this day and continues a spot on the White Pass tour. We loaded back on the bus and went to a small town in Skagway called Liarsville. As you can imagine, during the gold rush, there was a huge need to have news and reports coming out of the area.
Newspapermen and reporters of all kinds showed up in Skagway in order to report the news from the Yukon and all of the success of the prospectors. Unfortunately, when they got there, they found out just how treacherous the journey was, and while the intention was for them to be embedded with the prospectors over the mountain, they decided they were not going to do that and instead stayed in Skagway to report the news. Well, because they weren't invested or embedded with these prospectors, they decided that the best story would be the story that sells. They said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And that meant that they were taking prospectors' firsthand accounts, changing them to first person, and then publishing them. They were also maybe inflating a few of the details in order to make things look a lot different than they were. Hence, Liarsville.
The current attraction is set back away from the current town of Skagway itself, but it is a lot of fun to go and visit. To learn about the history of Liarsville, they do have the Liarsville Players who set up a little play about the history of the town. And there's even a little section of the town where you can pan for gold. And while there were multiple demonstrations, I was not successful at this endeavor at all. If you ever do find yourself in Liarsville, however, there is an opportunity for a salmon bake or roast or barbecue. And while with a place called Liarsville, I am a little suspect of some of the history. It's definitely worth looking into and checking out. After lunch, we loaded up back into the bus and headed back into the main town of Skagway. This is where we learned the story of Soapy Smith.
Soapy Smith was Skagway's first and best con man. He originally showed up and tried to sell soap, hence the name Soapy. He would set up a stall in front of his store and he would have bars of soap that were $1 each. Inside each bar, he claimed to have wrapped in money. $1, $5, $10, even $100. And he would ask people from the audience to come up and go ahead and buy some soap. So two men would come up, they would buy soap, they'd unwrap it right there, and of course, they would have won the money. Now, these two people were actually shills or plants in the audience, but people saw that it was possible, and this was a really great deal. I buy a dollar bar of soap, I get $50. And so then Soapy would then sell it. Of course, nobody else would be lucky because, they weren't his men.
In addition to this scam, Soapy also had a telegraph, which is really interesting because there were no telegraph lines in Skagway.
Soapy would collect money for the townspeople to send telegrams back to the lower 48. He would also collect money for people to wire to the lower 48. The problem is, because there were no telegraph lines, Soapy's line actually ran about 45 feet outside his telegraph office into the river. So instead of actually sending the telegrams, he was just pocketing the money. The people became quite fed up with Soapy, and they formed a mob to go out and stop his enterprise. One of the men, Frank Reid, actually challenged him to a duel, or they had a shootout. It's a little unclear. It is generally accepted that Soapy died immediately, and Frank died approximately a week later.
Frank was hailed as a hero and received a monument to his name, whereas Soapy has a wooden plaque marking his gravesite.
In addition to gold rushers and railroad builders and con men, there were also women in Skagway trying to make their way.
Our tour took us next to the Red Onion Saloon, which was a brothel or a house of ill repute in Skagway during the gold rush time.
It was not the only brothel in town, but it is the only one where the building still remains
Because there was
today.
a lot of competition, the Red Onion had to find ways to entice women to come and work for them. So they did a couple of things. Number one, they offered them up to $1.25 for every 15 minutes. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, considering number one, they were collecting $5 for every 15 minutes. But number two, the cost of living at the time was about $4 a day. And any legal profession that a woman could get into, she was only making about $3 a day. The second thing the Red Onion did was allowed women to decorate their rooms however they wanted to. So they could come in and choose their own wallpaper or their own curtains or their own decoration. When they renovated the building, they peeled back about 18 layers of wallpaper in one room alone. It's estimated that in a 2-year span, over 180 women worked at the Red Onion. This is where my husband and I left the official tour and decided to go ahead and walk through downtown Skagway. This isn't something that I normally do, but the port was only about 10 minutes away from downtown Skagway, so my husband and I thought it would be fun. One of the things we were really interested in seeing in downtown Skagway were the churches. Now let me explain. Our bus driver had let us know that during the gold rush, a lot of people that had moved in were unable to read or write. So the churches devised a brilliant plan, and that was to color code the buildings that they were
serving services in.
While I can't find any modern research to back this up, it is still conventionally known that the Catholic Church is known as the Green Church, the Assemblies of God was red, and the LDS Church, or the colloquial known as Mormon Church, was painted brown. And those building colors still stand today, and people of Skagway still refer to them as their colors rather their denominations. After all of that, it was time for us to head back to the ship in the land of the north wind and the east wind and the south wind. I'm telling you, I don't know how they could tell the direction the wind was coming from. It was very windy there.
Have you ever been to Skagway? Please comment. What was your favorite thing there? Or where do you think we should try to travel to? And if you like this video, of course, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you on our next journey.